My name is Jessica Miller, and this is the story of how my husband's family tried to humiliate us at what was supposed to be the happiest night of our lives, only to discover they had just insulted the most powerful man in the room. What happened next changed everything we thought we knew about respect, assumptions, and the dangerous game of judging people by their uniforms instead of their hearts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have seen it coming the moment Patricia Hartwell wrinkled her nose at David's work clothes hanging in our bedroom closet. It was 3 days before the annual Cedar Valley Hospital Foundation Gala, the biggest social event of the year in our small Ohio town, and David's mother had arrived unannounced for what she called a pre-event consultation. She stood in our modest Maple Street home like a queen surveying a peasant village, her perfectly manicured fingers trailing along our furniture as if checking for dust that might soil her designer dress. David was at the hospital pulling another night shift, which meant I was alone to face Patricia's inspection. She had insisted on staying with us for the week leading up to the gala, claiming it would give us family bonding time, but I knew better. Patricia Hartwell didn't bond with people she considered beneath her station, and after 3 years of marriage to her son, I knew exactly where I stood in her hierarchy. "Jessica, darling," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she fingered one of David's work uniforms. "Surely David doesn't plan to wear one of these dreadful outfits to the gala. I mean, I understand he has his little job at the hospital, but this is a formal event. People of importance will be there." I watched her hold up his navy blue work shirt like it was contaminated, her expression suggesting she might need to fumigate the entire closet. The shirt was clean, pressed, and bore the small Cedar Valley General Hospital logo on the pocket. To me, it represented David's dedication to his work, the late nights he spent ensuring the hospital ran smoothly, the pride he took in every task he performed. To Patricia, it was apparently evidence of our social failure. "David works very hard," I said carefully, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "And he has a proper tuxedo for the gala. He's been looking forward to this event for months." Patricia's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, sweet child, I'm sure he has. I imagine it's quite thrilling for someone in his position to attend such an elegant affair, but you must understand, the Hartwells have a reputation to maintain. When people see David with our family, they'll naturally assume he belongs to our social circle. We can't have them discovering he's just a janitor." The word just hit me like a slap. Patricia had a gift for making that single syllable carry the weight of complete dismissal, as if David's worth as a human being could be measured by her narrow definition of professional success. I had heard her use that word before, always with the same subtle cruelty, always designed to remind us that in her world, we would never measure up. "David isn't just anything," I replied, my voice stronger now. "He's intelligent, compassionate, and works incredibly hard. The hospital staff respects him tremendously." "I'm sure they do, dear," Patricia said, hanging the shirt back in the closet with visible distaste. "I'm sure the other custodial staff find him perfectly adequate. But let's be realistic about expectations. This gala will have doctors, administrators, board members, people who actually matter in the medical community. We need to manage how David presents himself so he doesn't embarrass the family." Before I could respond, the front door opened and Rebecca's voice echoed through the house. David's sister had arrived with her usual dramatic flair, her heels clicking against our hardwood floors like a countdown to conflict. Rebecca worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative, a job that paid well enough to fund her expensive tastes but not quite well enough to support her champagne dreams. She compensated for this gap by constantly reminding everyone that she was a Hartwell, as if the family name alone should open doors and command respect. "Mother, please tell me you've talked sense into them about the gala," Rebecca announced as she swept into the bedroom, dropping her designer purse on our bed without invitation. "I've already had to explain to 3 different people that my brother works at the hospital, and they keep asking what department he's in. It's becoming quite awkward. Patricia and Rebecca exchanged one of their meaningful looks, the kind that had always made me feel like an outsider looking in on a secret language I would never be invited to learn. They had perfected this silent communication over the years, a way of sharing thoughts and judgments without including anyone else in the conversation. "We were just discussing David's attire for tomorrow evening," Patricia said. "I was explaining to Jessica that perhaps it would be best if David were more selective about which hospital colleagues he mingles with at the event." Rebecca perched on the edge of our dresser, her expression brightening with malicious interest. "Oh, absolutely. I mean, we can't have him chatting with the janitorial staff in front of everyone. People might get the wrong idea about what he actually does there." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. David can talk to whoever he wants. These are his co-workers, people he sees every day. Why would he ignore them? "Because Jessica," Rebecca said with exaggerated patience, "image matters. When you're trying to elevate your social standing, you don't advertise your connections to the service industry. David should focus on networking with people who can actually help his career advancement." "What career advancement?" I asked. "David loves his work. He's never expressed any desire to do anything else." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia and Rebecca looked at each other again, then at me, with expressions that mixed pity and exasperation. It was clear they thought I was hopelessly naive, unable to grasp the obvious social dynamics they navigated so expertly. "Sweet Jessica," Patricia said finally, her tone suggesting she was explaining basic math to a child, "surely you don't believe David intends to remain a janitor forever? I mean, he's a bright boy when he applies himself. There must be opportunities for promotion within the hospital administration. Perhaps he could work his way up to a supervisory position, maybe even transition into a management role." I stared at her, genuinely confused. "David has never mentioned wanting to change positions. He seems perfectly happy with his current responsibilities." Rebecca snorted. "Happy? Jessica, no one is happy being a janitor. That's not a career, it's a temporary situation until something better comes along. David's probably just too embarrassed to admit he wants something more prestigious." The conversation was spiraling into familiar territory, the same circular arguments we'd had for 3 years. Patricia and Rebecca had never accepted that David might genuinely find fulfillment in work they considered beneath their family's dignity. They seemed convinced that his job was either a temporary setback or a character flaw that reflected poorly on their social standing. "Look," Patricia said, settling into our bedroom chair as if she owned it, "I'm not trying to be cruel. I actually care about David's future, and by extension yours. But you must understand that in certain social circles, perception is reality. Tomorrow night, there will be people at that gala who could potentially help David advance his career, but only if he presents himself."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Properly. And how exactly should he present himself?" I asked. "Well, for starters, he shouldn't go around telling people he's a janitor," Rebecca interjected. "He works at the hospital, that's true enough. People can draw their own conclusions about his specific role." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Exactly, it's not lying, it's simply being strategic about information sharing. David has been at Cedar Valley General for 5 years now? That shows stability and dedication. There's no need to elaborate on the specific nature of his duties." I felt like I was being pulled into some kind of bizarre alternate reality where being honest about your job was considered a social crime. "So you want David to deceive people about what he does for a living?" "Not deceive," Patricia corrected. "Reframe, position himself more favorably. For instance, instead of saying he's a janitor, he could say he's part of the hospital's operational support team." Technically accurate, but it sounds more professional. Rebecca clapped her hands together enthusiastically. "Perfect. And if anyone asks for specifics, he can redirect the conversation. Ask them about their work instead." People love talking about themselves. I looked between these two women, both so confident in their social maneuvering, both so certain that David's honest work was something to be ashamed of. They had constructed an elaborate fantasy where David was secretly ambitious for something more prestigious, where his contentment with his current position was just a facade hiding deeper professional aspirations. Have either of you ever actually asked David how he feels about his job? I said quietly. The question seemed to catch them off guard. Patricia's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment, and Rebecca actually looked annoyed. Of course we have, Patricia said, though her tone suggested otherwise. David's always been private about his feelings. But it's obvious that no one chooses to be a janitor. It's something you settle for when better options aren't available. Maybe, I said, my voice growing stronger. David doesn't see it as settling. Maybe he actually finds meaning in his work. Maybe he's proud of what he does. Rebecca laughed, a sharp sound that filled our bedroom like breaking glass. Proud, Jessica? Please. He pushes a mop around and empties trash cans. What's to be proud of? The casual cruelty in her voice finally broke something inside me. I had listened to their subtle insults and backhanded comments for 3 years, always trying to keep peace, always hoping they would eventually see David's worth. But this felt different. This felt like a direct attack on everything I loved about my husband. David keeps that hospital running, I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. He works nights so that doctors and nurses can focus on saving lives instead of worrying about their environment. He notices things other people miss. He cares about details that matter, and he does it all with more integrity and kindness than either of you have ever shown. Patricia's eyebrows rose in surprise. It was probably the first time I had ever directly challenged their authority, the first time I had refused to play along with their social games. My dear, she said coolly, there's no need to get emotional. We're simply trying to help David make the best impression possible tomorrow night. Surely you want him to succeed. David doesn't need your help to make a good impression, I replied. He makes a good impression by being himself, by being honest and genuine, and caring about other people. Those are qualities that actually matter. Rebecca stood up from the dresser, smoothing her skirt with sharp, angry movements. You know what, Jessica? If you want to stay trapped in this little middle-class fantasy where being a janitor is something to celebrate, that's your choice. But don't drag the Hartwell name down with you. Tomorrow night, people will be watching our family. They'll be judging us based on how David conducts himself. Let them judge, I said. David has nothing to be ashamed of. Patricia rose from her chair with regal precision, her expression suggesting that my defense of David was both tiresome and slightly pathetic. I can see we're not going to reach an understanding today. Perhaps after tomorrow night, when you've seen how these events actually work, you'll have a better appreciation for social realities. They swept out of the bedroom together, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and the bitter aftertaste of their disapproval. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at David's work clothes hanging in the closet, and felt a familiar mixture of anger and sadness wash over me. This wasn't the first time David's family had made their feelings clear about his career choice. It wasn't even the first time they had tried to coach me on how to manage his public image. But something about today felt different, more pointed, as if they were preparing for some kind of public confrontation, where David's job would become a source of family embarrassment. I thought about David, probably somewhere in the hospital right now, making his methodical rounds through each department, ensuring that everything was clean and functioning properly for the next day's operations. He took such pride in his work, such care in every task he performed. He knew the names of the nurses who worked double shifts, remembered which doctors preferred their coffee black, noticed when new equipment needed special attention. David had never expressed shame about his job, never indicated that he wanted something different or more prestigious. He came home each morning tired but satisfied, full of stories about the people he had helped, or the problems he had solved during his shift. He spoke about his work with the same passion that other people reserved for discussing their hobbies or their families. But now Patricia and Rebecca were determined to turn tomorrow night's gala into some kind of test of David's social worthiness, a public examination, where his value as a person would be measured against their arbitrary standards of professional success. They wanted him to hide his true self, to present a carefully constructed facade that would protect their precious family reputation. The worst part was that I could see the trap they were setting. Tomorrow night, surrounded by doctors and administrators and board members, David would be the obvious outsider. His honesty about his work would stand out in stark contrast to the carefully managed personas that dominated these kinds of events. Patricia and Rebecca would use that contrast to prove their point about social hierarchies and appropriate behavior, but they had no idea who they were actually dealing with. They had constructed their entire judgment of David based on assumptions and prejudices, never bothering to look deeper, never asking the right questions. Tomorrow night was going to be full of surprises, and I had a feeling that Patricia and Rebecca were about to learn some very uncomfortable truths about the dangerous game of judging people by their uniforms. That evening, David arrived home just as the sun was setting over our quiet Maple Street neighborhood. I heard his key in the front door, and felt that familiar flutter of relief that came with his safe return from each shift. He worked nights at Cedar Valley General, which meant our schedules rarely aligned perfectly, but we had learned to treasure these brief overlapping moments when we could actually see each other in daylight. I was sitting at our kitchen table, still processing the afternoon's confrontation with Patricia and Rebecca, when David walked in carrying a small bouquet of daisies from the hospital gift shop. His face lit up when he saw me, that genuine smile that had first captured my heart 4 years ago when we met at a community college evening class. Even after long shifts, even when exhaustion lined his features, David always managed to find energy for these small gestures of affection. "Hey beautiful," he said, kissing my forehead before placing the flowers in a water glass. "How was your day? Mom and Rebecca settle in okay?" I studied his face, looking for any sign that he shared his family's anxiety about tomorrow night's gala, any indication that he felt embarrassed or conflicted about his work. But David looked exactly as he always did after a shift, tired but content, proud of the work he had accomplished, eager to spend time with me, before catching a few hours of sleep. "Your mother had some interesting opinions about tomorrow night," I said carefully. "She seems concerned about how you'll present yourself at the gala." David paused in the middle of loosening his tie, a small frown creasing his forehead. "Present myself how? It's a formal dinner, right? I have my tuxedo from our wedding, what else would she be worried about?" The genuine confusion in his voice made my heart ache. David had no idea that his family considered his job a source of embarrassment, no clue that they spent their time strategizing ways to minimize the social impact of his career choice. In his mind, the gala was simply a fun evening out, a chance to celebrate the hospital that had become such an important part of his life. "She thinks you should be careful about who you talk to," I said, choosing my words carefully. "She's worried that if you're too friendly with certain coworkers, people might get the wrong impression about your position at the hospital." David sat down across from me, at the table, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked like hurt understanding. "She means the janitorial staff, doesn't she? She doesn't want people to know I'm a janitor." The quiet resignation in his voice broke my heart. This wasn't the first time David had encountered this kind of prejudice, and his matter-of-fact acceptance suggested that he had long ago stopped expecting different treatment from his own family. "David," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand, "you know I'm proud of what you do, right? You know that your job doesn't define your worth as a person." His smile was sad, but genuine. "I know, Jess, and I appreciate that more than you realize. But I also know how my family sees things. They've never understood why I chose this work, why I stay in this position, when I could probably do something they'd consider more prestigious." "Could you?" I asked. "Do something else, I mean. If you wanted to." David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on our wooden table. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I had never heard before, as if he were sharing something he had kept carefully guarded. "There are always opportunities," he said slowly. "The hospital is a big organization, lots of different departments, lots of different ways to contribute. But I love what I do, Jessica. I love the night shift, the quiet moments when the hospital settles into its rhythm. I love knowing that I'm part of something important, even if my role seems invisible to most people." Something in his tone made me study his face more carefully. David was choosing his words with unusual precision, as if there were layers of meaning I wasn't quite grasping. But before I could ask for clarification, we heard Patricia's heels clicking down the hallway toward the kitchen. She appeared in the doorway, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, her expression tight with disapproval. Behind her, Rebecca clutched a glass of wine and wore the satisfied look of someone who had been discussing other people's shortcomings for the past several hours. "David, darling," Patricia said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to deliver unwelcome advice, "I was hoping we could have a little chat about tomorrow evening, just some family guidance to help you make the best impression possible." David straightened in his chair, and I watched his expression shift into the polite mask he always wore when dealing with his family's criticism. It was a look I had seen too many times before, a careful neutrality that protected him from their judgments while avoiding direct confrontation. "Of course, Mom," he said. "What did you want to discuss?" Patricia settled into the chair next to him, with the air of someone preparing to deliver a lecture. Rebecca remained standing, positioning herself where she could observe David's reactions to their advice. "Well," Patricia began, "I think we should talk about networking strategy. Tomorrow night will be an excellent opportunity for you to make connections with people who could potentially help your career development. But you'll need to be thoughtful about how you present yourself." David nodded politely, but I could see the tension building in his shoulders. "What kind of presentation did you have in mind?" "Nothing dramatic," Rebecca interjected, "just some basic social positioning. When people ask about your work, you should emphasize your connection to the hospital, without getting too specific about your exact duties." "You want me to lie about my job?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Not lie, darling, simply frame things in the most positive light possible. You work at Cedar Valley General Hospital, that's completely true. People can draw their own conclusions about your specific role." I watched David's face carefully, looking for signs of anger or frustration, but he maintained that same polite composure. However, I noticed his hands had clenched slightly in his lap, a subtle tell that suggested he was working hard to control his emotional response. "And if someone asks directly about what I do," David said, "redirect the conversation." Rebecca suggested, "Ask them about their work instead. People love talking about themselves, or you could mention some of the interesting cases you've observed at the hospital. You must overhear fascinating medical discussions during your shifts." The casual way Rebecca assumed David was eavesdropping on private medical conversations made me want to scream. These women had such a fundamentally warped understanding of David's character, his ethics, his professional responsibilities. They seemed to think his job involved wandering around collecting gossip rather than performing essential work with dignity and discretion. "I don't eavesdrop on medical discussions," David said quietly. "Patient confidentiality is serious business at the hospital. Everyone who works there, regardless of their position, is expected to maintain strict professional standards." Patricia's expression suggested that David was being unnecessarily rigid about workplace ethics. "Of course, darling, I'm not suggesting you violate any policies. I'm simply saying that working in a hospital environment must give you exposure to interesting medical developments that you could discuss in social settings." "Mom," David said, and something in his tone made both Patricia and Rebecca pause, "I appreciate your concern about tomorrow night, but I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. I'm proud of my work at the hospital. If people have a problem with that, then those probably aren't people I need to impress." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Patricia's carefully composed expression cracked slightly, revealing the frustration that lurked beneath her maternal concern. Rebecca set down her wineglass with a sharp click that echoed through our small kitchen. "David," Patricia said, her voice taking on the sharp edge she used when her authority was being challenged, "I understand that you have some sentimental attachment to your current position. But you must think about the bigger picture. Tomorrow night represents an opportunity to elevate your social standing, to make connections that could benefit your future. Why would you deliberately sabotage that by advertising your limitations?" "What limitations?" David asked, and for the first time, I heard a note of steel in his voice. Rebecca stepped forward, clearly sensing that the conversation was spiraling beyond Patricia's control. "David, let's be realistic. You're a janitor at a hospital. That's fine, it's honest work, but it's not exactly a career that opens doors or commands respect. Mom is trying to help you position yourself more strategically." "Position myself as what?" David said, standing up from the table. "As someone ashamed of honest work, as someone who thinks my value as a person depends on impressing strangers at a fancy dinner." Patricia rose as well, her full height and imperious bearing designed to remind David of family hierarchies and his place within them. "David, you're being deliberately obtuse. This isn't about shame, it's about opportunity. There will be important people at tomorrow night's gala, people who could potentially help you advance your career if you make the right impression." "And what if I don't want to advance my career?" David asked. "What if I'm satisfied with the work I'm doing? What if I find meaning and purpose in my current position?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia and Rebecca exchanged one of their meaningful looks, and I could practically see them recalibrating their approach. They had expected resistance, but not this kind of principled defense of a job they considered beneath the family's dignity. "Satisfied," Rebecca said, her voice rising with incredulity. "David, you're 34 years old. You can't seriously plan to spend the rest of your life mopping floors and emptying trash cans. What kind of future does that offer? What kind of legacy is that?" David was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a depth of conviction that surprised even me. "The kind of future where I go to bed every night knowing that I've contributed something meaningful to the world. The kind of legacy where people remember that I treated everyone with respect, regardless of their position or status. The kind of life where my worth isn't measured by other people's narrow definitions of success." Patricia's face had gone pale with what looked like genuine shock. I realized that this was probably the first time David had ever directly challenged their assumptions about his career, the first time he had refused to apologize for choices that brought him satisfaction. "David," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "you're being naive. In the real world, perception matters. Social standing matters. Tomorrow night, you'll be representing the Hartwell family name. People will judge all of us, based on how you conduct yourself. Then maybe," David said quietly, "you should trust me to conduct myself well." The confrontation might have escalated further, but David's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. "I need to head back to the hospital," he said, tucking the phone into his pocket. "Emergency situation, they need extra hands on deck tonight." Patricia frowned. "Emergency? What kind of emergency requires a janitor in the middle of the evening?" David paused in the doorway, and for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of something in his expression that looked almost like amusement. The kind that requires someone who knows the hospital inside and out, who can coordinate with multiple departments, and who can be trusted to handle sensitive situations professionally. He kissed my cheek and grabbed his keys from the counter. "I'll see you tomorrow evening for the gala. And Mom, Rebecca, I hope you'll both enjoy the event, it should be very educational." After David left, Patricia and Rebecca remained in our kitchen, their carefully planned intervention having backfired spectacularly. They had expected to find a son and brother, who was embarrassed by his work, eager to present a more prestigious facade to the world. Instead, they had encountered someone who was genuinely proud of his contributions, unwilling to compromise his integrity for their social comfort. Well, Patricia said finally, settling back into her chair with the air of someone regrouping after an unexpected defeat. I suppose we'll just have to hope for the best tomorrow night. Rebecca poured herself another glass of wine, her movements sharp with frustration. I still think he's making a mistake. When people find out he's a janitor, it's going to reflect on all of us. I looked between these two women, both so certain that David's honesty would be a source of family embarrassment, both so convinced that his job diminished their social standing. They had no idea that tomorrow night was going to challenge every assumption they had made about worth and respect, and the complex dynamics of power within Cedar Valley General Hospital. The next morning brought a flurry of preparation activity that seemed designed to transform our modest home into mission control for a military operation. Patricia had taken over our dining room table, spreading out seating charts, guest lists, and detailed schedules for the evening's events. Rebecca commandeered our living room, turning it into a staging area for her extensive collection of formal wear options. I watched this invasion with growing unease, not because of the disruption to our normal routine, but because of the intensity with which Patricia and Rebecca were approaching the gala. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones about networking opportunities and strategic conversations, as if they were preparing for battle rather than a charitable fundraising dinner. "Jessica, darling," Patricia called from the dining room, "could you come look at this seating arrangement? I want to make sure David is positioned favorably for the evening." I found her hunched over a detailed floor plan of the hotel ballroom where the gala would be held. She had marked various tables with different colored pens, creating what looked like a complex battle strategy rather than a simple dinner seating chart. "Favorably how?" I asked, studying the intricate markings and annotations covering the paper. "Well," Patricia said, pointing to a table near the front of the room, "I've managed to arrange for David to be seated at table 7, which puts him in close proximity to several hospital board members and department heads. If he plays his cards right, he could make some very valuable connections." I stared at the seating chart, confused by the level of detail Patricia had somehow obtained. "How did you get access to the official seating arrangements?" "I thought those were handled by the hospital's event planning committee." Patricia's smile was mysterious and slightly smug. "Let's just say that the Hartwell name still carries some influence in this town. I have friends on the hospital's board of trustees who were happy to share information about tomorrow night's arrangements." The casual way she mentioned her connections to the hospital's leadership made me wonder what else Patricia knew about Cedar Valley General that she hadn't shared with us. She spoke about the institution with the familiarity of someone who had insider knowledge, someone who understood the complex social and political dynamics that govern the hospital's operations. "The key," Rebecca said, appearing in the doorway with an armload of jewelry options, "is for David to focus his conversation on the right people. Table 7 includes Dr. Morrison from cardiology, Miss Stevens from hospital administration, and at least 2 members of the board of directors. Those are exactly the kinds of connections that could help David transition into a more suitable position." I felt that familiar surge of irritation at Rebecca's assumption that David wanted or needed to transition anywhere. "Has it occurred to either of you that David might be happy with his current work? That he might not want to change positions?" Patricia and Rebecca exchanged one of their loaded glances, and I could see them preparing to launch into another lecture about social realities and career advancement. But before they could speak, my phone rang with a call from Amanda Foster, my closest friend and the one person who had consistently supported my marriage despite the Hartwell family's obvious disapproval. "Jess," Amanda's voice was excited and slightly breathless, "I just heard the most interesting gossip about tonight's gala. You're not going to believe what I found out about the evening's special presentation." I stepped away from Patricia and Rebecca, moving into the kitchen where I could speak more privately. "What kind of special presentation?" "Apparently," Amanda said, lowering her voice as if she were sharing state secrets, "the hospital board is planning to make a major announcement tonight. Something about new leadership, a reorganization of the administrative structure. My source at the hospital said it's going to be a big surprise, something that will change how people think about Cedar Valley General. The cryptic nature of Amanda's information made me curious, but I couldn't see how it would affect David or our evening plans. Hospital administrative changes seemed like the kind of dry institutional business that would interest board members and department heads, but have little impact on frontline workers like David. That sounds like typical hospital politics, I said. I'm sure it'll be fascinating for the people directly involved, but I can't imagine it affecting us very much. Amanda was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of concern. Jess, there's something else. My contact mentioned that tonight's announcement involves someone who's been working behind the scenes for years, someone whose real role at the hospital isn't widely known. She seemed to think it was going to be quite a shock for people who thought they understood the hospital's power structure. A strange chill ran down my spine as Amanda's words sank in. There was something about her description that felt familiar, something that reminded me of David's careful responses to his family's questions about career advancement opportunities. Amanda, I said slowly, what exactly did your contact say about this mystery person? Not much, Amanda admitted. Just that they've been deliberately maintaining a low profile, working in a position that doesn't reflect their actual responsibilities or authority. Apparently, tonight's announcement is going to reveal their true role in the hospital's operations. Before I could ask for more details, Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression sharp with curiosity about my phone conversation. I quickly wrapped up the call with Amanda, promising to fill her in on all the evening's drama after the gala was over. Who was that? Patricia asked as I hung up the phone. Just Amanda, I said. She was calling to wish us luck tonight. Patricia nodded absently, but I could see her mind was already back on her strategic planning for the evening ahead. She had invested too much energy in positioning David for social success to be distracted by random phone calls from my friends. The rest of the day passed in a blur of final preparations, last-minute wardrobe adjustments, and increasingly detailed coaching sessions as Patricia and Rebecca tried to prepare David for what they saw as the social performance of his lifetime. When David finally arrived home from his day shift, looking relaxed and cheerful despite the family tension that had been building all week, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Ready for our big night out? He asked, wrapping his arms around me in the kind of easy embrace that made all of Patricia and Rebecca's social anxiety seem ridiculous. As ready as I'll ever be, I said, studying his face for any signs of nervousness about the evening ahead. But David looked exactly as he always did before formal events, excited about the opportunity to dress up and spend an elegant evening together. It wasn't until we were all gathered in our living room, dressed in our formal wear and preparing to leave for the hotel, that I noticed something different about David's demeanor. He stood at our front window, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease, and there was something in his posture that suggested quiet confidence rather than social anxiety. Patricia emerged from our guest bathroom in a cloud of expensive perfume, resplendent in a midnight blue gown that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. Rebecca followed close behind, her silver dress chosen specifically to complement her mother's outfit and create a unified family presentation. David, Patricia said, giving him a final once-over as if inspecting a soldier before battle, you look very handsome. Remember what we discussed about conversation strategy and please try to make a good impression on the people who matter. David smiled at his mother with genuine warmth, but I caught something in his expression that looked almost like private amusement. Don't worry, Mom. I think tonight is going to be very memorable for everyone involved. The comment seemed innocuous enough, but something in David's tone made me study his face more carefully. There was a calm certainty in his voice that suggested he knew something the rest of us didn't, something that would make the evening far more interesting than anyone anticipated. As we prepared to leave for what Patricia and Rebecca had built up as David's crucial social test, I found myself wondering if they had any idea what they were actually walking into. The evening that was supposed to prove David's social limitations might turn out to reveal limitations of an entirely different kind. The Grand Cedar Hotel's ballroom had been transformed into something that belonged in a fairy tale rather than our modest Ohio town. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls draped in deep burgundy fabric, while centerpieces of white roses and gold accents adorned each of the 30 round tables scattered throughout the space. The Cedar Valley Hospital Foundation's annual gala was clearly the social event Patricia and Rebecca had promised, attracting what appeared to be every person of influence within a 50-mile radius. I felt David's hand squeeze mine gently as we paused in the ballroom's entrance, both of us taking a moment to absorb the elegant atmosphere. Around us, couples in evening wear moved with the practiced grace of people accustomed to formal events, their conversations creating a sophisticated hum that spoke of business deals, charitable commitments, and the intricate social networking that drove small-town power structures. "Quite a turnout," David murmured, his voice carrying that same note of quiet amusement I had noticed at home. He seemed completely at ease in his black tuxedo, moving through the crowd with natural confidence that contradicted his family's assumptions about his social capabilities. Patricia appeared at my elbow, her sharp eyes already scanning the room for strategic networking opportunities. "David, darling, there's Dr. Morrison by the bar. He's the head of cardiology, exactly the kind of person you should introduce yourself to. Remember what we discussed about positioning yourself favorably?" Before David could respond, a distinguished woman in an elegant navy dress approached our small group. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect in professional settings. "Good evening," she said, extending her hand toward David with a warm smile. "You must be Mr. Miller. I'm Dr. Catherine Brooks, Chief of Staff at Cedar Valley General. I've been looking forward to meeting you." The introduction sent a ripple of surprise through Patricia and Rebecca. Dr. Brooks was clearly a person of significant importance at the hospital, exactly the kind of high-level administrator they had hoped David might somehow encounter during the evening. But her direct approach and obvious familiarity with David's name suggested a connection they hadn't anticipated. "Dr. Brooks," David said, shaking her hand with easy familiarity, "it's wonderful to see you outside the hospital setting. Thank you for including us in tonight's celebration." Patricia stepped forward quickly, clearly sensing an opportunity to insert herself into what appeared to be a promising networking connection. "Dr. Brooks, how lovely to meet you. I'm Patricia Hartwell, David's mother. It's so nice to know that the hospital's leadership takes a personal interest in all their employees." Dr. Brooks turned toward Patricia with polite attention, but something in her expression suggested careful consideration of her words. "Mrs. Hartwell, yes, David has mentioned his family. And you're absolutely right about our personal interest in employees. Though I should clarify that my connection to your son goes well beyond the typical administrator-employee relationship." The comment hung in the air like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture Patricia and Rebecca had constructed of David's position at the hospital. I watched their faces carefully, noting the confusion that flickered across their composed expressions as they tried to interpret Dr. Brooks' meaning. "Oh?" Rebecca interjected, her voice bright with curiosity. "Are you involved in some kind of employee mentorship program? That would be wonderful for David's professional development." Dr. Brooks' smile took on a quality that suggested she was enjoying some private joke. "You could say that Mrs. Hartwell's son has been instrumental in several important developments at our facility. His insights and recommendations have shaped some of our most significant policy decisions over the past few years." I felt David's hand tighten slightly on mine, and when I glanced at his face I caught an expression that looked suspiciously like someone trying not to laugh. There was clearly something happening beneath the surface of this conversation, some layer of meaning that Patricia and Rebecca were missing entirely. Policy decisions, Patricia repeated, her voice rising slightly with excitement. David, you never mentioned being involved in hospital policy work. That sounds much more substantial than your usual responsibilities. David opened his mouth to respond, but Dr. Brooks smoothly intervened. I'm afraid I need to steal Mr. Miller away for a few minutes. There are some people I'd like him to meet before tonight's presentation begins. I hope you'll excuse us. She guided David away from our small group with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing social situations. As they moved across the ballroom, I noticed other hospital staff members approaching David with greetings that seemed far warmer and more respectful than what I would have expected for someone in a basic maintenance position. Did you see that? Rebecca whispered urgently, her eyes following David's progress through the crowd. Dr. Brooks obviously knows something about David's potential that we haven't recognized. This could be the break he needs to move into a more appropriate position. Patricia nodded enthusiastically, her earlier concerns about David's social presentation apparently forgotten in the face of this unexpected administrative attention. I knew there had to be more to his work than he was letting on. David's always been modest about his accomplishments, but clearly he's made quite an impression on the hospital's leadership. I watched from across the room as David was introduced to what appeared to be a succession of board members and department heads. Each person greeted him with obvious warmth and respect, engaging in conversations that looked far more substantive than polite social chatter. There was something about these interactions that suggested established relationships, rather than new networking connections. Ladies and gentlemen, a voice announced over the ballroom's sound system. Please take your seats. Tonight's program will begin in just a few minutes. We found our assigned table number 7 as Patricia had arranged, positioned strategically near the front of the room with clear sight lines to the evening speakers. Our table mates included several people Patricia had identified as important networking targets, including Dr. Morrison from cardiology and Miss Stevens from hospital administration. As we settled into our seats, I noticed that David's chair remained empty. He was still somewhere across the room, engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly serious conversation with a group of board members and hospital executives. Where is David? Patricia murmured, glancing around the ballroom with growing concern. The program is starting and he's missing the perfect opportunity to make connections with our table mates. Before anyone could answer, the lights dimmed and Dr. William Chen, chairman of the hospital board, approached the podium at the front of the room. He was an elderly man with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of authority, and his presence immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the ballroom. Good evening, friends and supporters of Cedar Valley General Hospital. Dr. Chen began, his voice carrying easily through the sophisticated sound system. Tonight we gather not just to celebrate our institution's achievements, but to recognize the extraordinary individuals who make our mission possible. The opening remarks followed the predictable pattern of formal fundraising events, with acknowledgments of major donors, updates on hospital expansion projects, and tributes to retiring staff members. Patricia and Rebecca listened with polite attention, but I could see them growing increasingly anxious about David's continued absence from our table. And now Dr. Chen continued, I'd like to address a matter that has been several years in the making. As you know, effective healthcare delivery requires leadership at every level of our organization. Tonight I have the privilege of recognizing someone whose contributions to our hospital have been both extraordinary and deliberately understated. Something in Dr. Chen's tone made the entire ballroom fall into complete silence. This was clearly the special announcement Amanda had mentioned, the administrative change that was supposed to surprise people who thought they understood the hospital's power structure. For the past 5 years, Dr. Chen said, Cedar Valley General has benefited from the guidance of someone who chose to work behind the scenes, learning our operations from the ground up, understanding every aspect of our facility's daily functions. This individual has conducted what amounts to a comprehensive organizational analysis, identifying inefficiencies, recommending improvements, and building relationships with staff at every level. Patricia grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh as the implications of Dr. Chen's words began to sink in. Across the ballroom, I could see David standing near the side of the room, no longer engaged in casual conversation but clearly waiting for something. This approach to leadership development is unconventional, Dr. Chen continued, but the results have been remarkable. Our patient satisfaction scores have improved dramatically, our operational efficiency has reached unprecedented levels, and our staff retention rates are the best in the region. These achievements didn't happen by accident. The room was so quiet I could hear the soft clink of glasses as servers moved discreetly between tables. Everyone seemed to sense that they were about to witness something significant, something that would challenge their assumptions about how power and authority operated within their community's most important institution. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Chen said, his voice rising with unmistakable pride, "it is my honor to introduce Cedar Valley General Hospital's new Chief Executive Officer, Dr. David Miller." The words hit the ballroom like a thunderclap. Around our table I heard several sharp gasps as people processed the announcement. Patricia's grip on my arm tightened to the point of pain, while Rebecca's wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. But the most profound silence came from the hospital staff scattered throughout the room. They weren't surprised by the announcement, I realized. They had known all along who David really was, what his real role had been during those night shifts Patricia and Rebecca had dismissed as menial labor. David stepped forward toward the podium, moving with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable with public speaking and formal presentations. As he passed our table, he caught my eye and offered a small smile that seemed to acknowledge the earthquake that had just rearranged our family's entire understanding of reality. "Thank you, Dr. Chen," David said as he reached the microphone, his voice carrying the same warmth and genuineness that had attracted me to him 4 years ago. "And thank you all for the trust you've placed in me during this transition period." Patricia was staring at her son as if she had never seen him before. Her mouth moved silently, trying to form words that could somehow make sense of what she was witnessing. Rebecca had gone completely pale, her carefully applied makeup standing out in stark contrast to her shocked expression. "When I first arrived at Cedar Valley General 5 years ago," David continued, "I made a deliberate decision to learn this organization from the foundation up. I wanted to understand not just the administrative structure but the daily realities faced by every person who contributes to our mission." His words were calm and measured, but I could hear the passion underlying his professional presentation. This was David talking about work he genuinely loved, responsibilities he had embraced, not out of social ambition but out of authentic commitment to healthcare and community service. During these years, I've had the privilege of working alongside some of the most dedicated professionals I've ever encountered. I've learned from night shift nurses who maintain compassion despite exhaustion, from maintenance staff who take pride in creating healing environments, from administrators who balance competing demands while never losing sight of patient care. Around the ballroom, I could see hospital employees nodding with recognition and approval. They understood what David was describing because they had worked with him during those night shifts, had seen him approach every task with respect and attention to detail. "This experience has taught me that effective leadership isn't about hierarchy or status," David said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about principles that clearly drove his professional philosophy. "It's about understanding that every role within our organization contributes to our patients' well-being, and that genuine respect for all team members creates the foundation for excellent healthcare delivery." Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "He's a doctor. David is a doctor, and he's been running the hospital." The revelation was hitting her in waves as she processed not just David's true position, but the implications of 5 years of family conversations where she had dismissed his work as meaningless, where she had coached him to hide his professional identity, where she had treated his career as a source of family embarrassment. "The janitor uniform," Rebecca said faintly, her voice hollow with dawning understanding. "He wore janitor uniforms because he was learning janitorial operations. He was learning everything." Dr. Chen returned to the microphone as David stepped back,
but the formal program seemed almost anticlimactic after the bombshell that had just exploded our family's assumptions. Around us, other guests were beginning to recover from their surprise, offering polite applause and murmurs of congratulation. But at our table, Patricia and Rebecca sat in stunned silence, their entire framework for understanding David's life crumbling around them. Every conversation they had initiated about his career advancement, every piece of advice they had offered about social positioning, every expression of concern about his professional limitations now revealed itself as a monument to their own ignorance. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. They had spent years worrying that David's honest work would embarrass the Hartwell family name, never realizing that their son was actually the most powerful person in the room, someone whose real achievements far exceeded anything they had ever imagined possible. As the formal program concluded and guests began to move around the ballroom for networking and socializing, David made his way back to our table. He moved through the crowd with the easy authority of someone accustomed to respect and recognition, accepting congratulations from colleagues and community leaders who clearly understood his significance within the hospital's hierarchy. When he reached our table, Patricia and Rebecca stared at him as if he were a complete stranger rather than the family member they had been lecturing about social advancement just hours earlier. The David they thought they knew, the underachieving son who needed career guidance and strategic coaching, had been revealed as an elaborate fiction created by their own assumptions and prejudices. Surprised, David said quietly, settling into his chair beside me with a slight smile that acknowledged the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Patricia's voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. "You let us believe you were a janitor. For 5 years you let us think you were just cleaning floors and emptying trash cans." "I was cleaning floors and emptying trash cans," David replied calmly, "along with learning every other aspect of hospital operations. It was the most comprehensive management training program I could have designed." Rebecca leaned forward, her expression shifting from shock to something that looked like anger. "You deliberately deceived us. You let us worry about your future. Let us give you advice about career advancement, when all along you were running the entire hospital." The accusation hung in the air between them, and I could see David considering his response carefully. This was the moment when years of family dynamics would either shift toward understanding or crystallize into permanent resentment. "I never lied to anyone about my work," David said finally. "I told you I worked at the hospital, that I found my responsibilities fulfilling, that I was proud of what I accomplished each day. Those things were completely true. But you never told us you were a doctor," Patricia said, her voice rising with frustration. "You never mentioned that you were being groomed for executive leadership. You let us assume you were in a menial position." David was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice carried a sadness that made my heart ache for him. "Mom, did you ever ask what specific work I was doing at the hospital? Did you ever inquire about my educational background or my long-term professional goals?" The questions hit their target with devastating accuracy. I watched Patricia's face as she realized that her assumptions about David's career had been based on willful ignorance rather than incomplete information. She had seen his work clothes and jumped to conclusions without ever bothering to investigate the reality of his professional life. "We assumed," Rebecca said defensively, "that if you were doing something important you would have told us." "I tried," David replied quietly. "Every time I mentioned finding fulfillment in my work, every time I said I was proud of my contributions, every time I had opportunities for growth within the hospital system, you dismissed those statements as naive optimism from someone who didn't understand
Professional realities. The truth of his words was undeniable. I had witnessed years of conversations where David had attempted to share his satisfaction with his work, only to be met with patronizing advice about the need for career advancement and social positioning. As the evening continued around us, other gala guests began approaching our table to offer congratulations to David and his family. Each interaction served as another reminder of the gap between perception and reality that had defined our family relationships for so many years. Dr. Morrison, the cardiologist Patricia had identified as an important networking contact, stopped by to shake David's hand. "Congratulations on the promotion, David." Though I suppose it's more of an official recognition than an actual promotion, considering you've been doing the job for months already." Patricia managed a weak smile, but I could see her struggling to process the casual familiarity with which Dr. Morrison addressed her son. This wasn't the respectful deference she would have expected from a senior physician speaking to a maintenance worker, but the collegial warmth between professional equals. Miss Stevens from hospital administration was equally congratulatory, adding, "The staff is thrilled about your appointment, David. Your open-door policy and genuine concern for employee welfare have made such a difference in workplace morale." With each interaction, it became clearer that David's true role at the hospital had been an open secret to everyone except his own family. The night shifts that Patricia and Rebecca had viewed as evidence of limited career prospects had actually been David's way of staying connected to frontline operations while managing executive responsibilities during traditional business hours. The evening that was supposed to test David's social capabilities had instead revealed the breadth of his professional relationships and the depth of respect he commanded throughout the healthcare community. Every person who approached our table treated him as someone whose opinions mattered, whose leadership was valued, whose contributions were essential to the hospital's success. But perhaps the most telling moment came when a young woman in scrubs approached our table during a brief lull in the congratulatory visits. She looked tired, as if she had come directly from a hospital shift, and her approach was tentative, as if she wasn't sure she belonged in such an elegant social setting. "Dr. Miller," she said quietly, "I know you're busy, but I wanted to thank you for what you said about respecting all team members. It means a lot to those of us who usually get overlooked at events like this." David's face lit up with genuine pleasure at seeing her. "Maria, I'm so glad you could make it tonight. Everyone, I'd like you to introduce Maria Rodriguez. She's one of our finest surgical technicians and the person who suggested the equipment sterilization protocol that reduced our infection rates by 30% last year." The introduction was vintage David, highlighting someone else's achievements and ensuring that a frontline employee felt valued and recognized. But watching Patricia and Rebecca's reaction to this exchange, I could see them finally beginning to understand the kind of leader their son had become. This wasn't the David they thought they knew, the underachiever who needed their guidance and social coaching. This was someone who commanded respect through competence and earned loyalty through genuine care for the people around him. The 5 years they had spent worrying about his professional limitations had actually been 5 years of watching one of the most effective healthcare executives in the region develop his leadership philosophy and management approach. As the evening wound down and guests began to make their farewells, our family found itself alone at table 7, surrounded by the debris of assumptions that had been shattered beyond repair. Patricia and Rebecca sat in contemplative silence, their elegant gowns and careful makeup unable to disguise the emotional exhaustion of having their worldview completely overturned. The gala that was supposed to be David's social test had instead become their education in the dangerous consequences of judging people based on superficial appearances rather than taking the time to understand the complexity and depth of their actual lives and achievements. The drive home from the gala passed in complete silence, our car filled with a tension so thick it felt like a living thing occupying the space between us. Patricia sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead through the windshield as if the familiar streets of Cedar Valley had suddenly become foreign territory requiring intense navigation. Rebecca had claimed the back seat, positioning herself directly behind me so I couldn't see her face in the rearview mirror, though I could feel the waves of mortification radiating from her direction. David drove with his usual calm competence, apparently unaffected by the emotional chaos swirling around him. He had changed out of his tuxedo and back into casual clothes before we left the hotel, but somehow he still carried himself with the quiet authority that had been revealed so dramatically during the evening's announcements. The transformation wasn't in his appearance or his manner, I realized, but in my understanding of who he had always been. When we finally pulled into our driveway on Maple Street, Patricia made no move to exit the vehicle. She sat frozen in her seat as if movement might somehow make the evening's revelations more real than they already were. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then moved beyond uncomfortable into something that felt almost dangerous. "David," Patricia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." "Of course," David replied, turning off the engine and pocketing his keys. "Should we go inside?" The short walk to our front door felt like a funeral procession. Patricia and Rebecca moved with the measured steps of people approaching their own judgment, while David maintained the same relaxed demeanor he always displayed after successful work events. I found myself caught between conflicting emotions, part of me angry at his family's years of dismissive treatment, another part feeling genuine sympathy for the magnitude of their shock and embarrassment. Once inside our living room, Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out strained and uncertain in a way I had never heard from her before. "David, I need to understand something. When did you complete your medical degree? When did you become qualified for hospital administration? There are years of your life that we apparently know nothing about." David settled into his favorite armchair, the same spot where he had sat countless times while his mother and sister lectured him about career advancement and social positioning. But now the power dynamics in our living room had shifted completely, though his gentle manner remained unchanged. "I finished my MD at Case Western when I was 26, David said, "then I completed an MBA in healthcare administration at Ohio State. I was recruited by Cedar Valley General directly from graduate school, with the understanding that I would spend several years learning operations before transitioning into executive leadership." Patricia's face went even paler as the timeline became clear. "That was before you met Jessica. You've been a doctor the entire time we've known you." "Yes," David confirmed simply. Rebecca leaned forward from her position on our couch, her voice tight with frustration and something that sounded like betrayal. "Then why the charade? Why the janitor uniforms and the night shifts and letting us think you were some kind of underachiever who needed our guidance?" The question hung in our living room like an accusation, and I watched David's expression carefully as he considered his response. This was the moment when he would either excuse his family's behavior or hold them accountable for their assumptions and judgments. "Rebecca," David said quietly, "I never told you I was a janitor. I told you I worked at the hospital. When you saw my work clothes and jumped to conclusions, I didn't correct you because I was curious to see how you would treat someone you perceived as having a less prestigious job." The words landed like physical blows. Patricia's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of shock, while Rebecca's mouth fell open as she processed the implications of David's admission. "You were testing us," Patricia said, her voice rising with indignation. "For 5 years you've been conducting some kind of social experiment on your own family." "Not an experiment," David replied calmly. "An education. I wanted to understand how you really felt about people in service positions, about honest work, about the value of different contributions to society. Your behavior toward me told me everything I needed to know about your character." The accusation was delivered so gently that it took a moment for its full impact to register. David wasn't just revealing his deception, he was explaining that their treatment of him had been a character test they had failed spectacularly. "That's not fair," Rebecca protested. "We were trying to help you. We thought you were stuck in a dead-end job, and we wanted you to have opportunities for advancement." David's smile was sad but not unkind. "Rebecca, in 5 years of conversations about my career, did you ever once ask if I was happy with my work? Did you ever inquire about what I actually did during my shifts? Did you ever express interest in understanding why I found my responsibilities fulfilling?" The questions created another uncomfortable silence as Patricia and Rebecca were forced to confront the reality of their own incuriosity about David's professional life. They had constructed an entire narrative about his career based on superficial observations and social prejudices, without ever bothering to investigate the facts. "We were concerned about your future," Patricia said defensively. "We wanted you to have the kind of career that would provide security and respect." "Mom," David said, and something in his tone made her flinch, "I'm the chief executive officer of a 500-bed hospital. I oversee a budget of $200 million and make decisions that affect the healthcare of 60,000 people in this region. How exactly is that lacking in security or respect?" The magnitude of David's actual responsibilities hit Patricia like a physical force. She had spent years worrying about her son's professional prospects while he was quietly building one of the most significant careers in their entire community. "But the way you presented yourself," Rebecca said, her voice taking on a desperate edge as she tried to justify their behavior. "The work clothes, the night shifts, never talking about your real responsibilities. How were we supposed to know?" David leaned back in his chair, and I could see him making a decision about how directly to address his family's willful blindness to his actual situation. "Rebecca," he said, "last Christmas, when you asked what I wanted for the holiday, I told you I was hoping for a new stethoscope because mine was getting worn from daily use. Did you think hospital janitors used stethoscopes?" Rebecca's face flushed red as she remembered the conversation. "I thought you were joking. I thought it was some kind of weird joke about wanting to be a doctor. When Mom asked about my educational background during Jessica's birthday dinner 2 years ago, I mentioned that I had graduate degrees in medicine and business administration. Do you remember what she said?" Patricia's voice was barely audible. "I said it was nice that you were taking classes to improve yourself, even if they wouldn't directly help with your current job. And when I tried to explain that my night work involved patient consultations and administrative oversight, you told me I was probably confused about my actual job duties because nighttime work could be disorienting." The litany of dismissed revelations was devastating in its completeness. David had apparently made numerous attempts to share his real professional life with his family, only to have each effort reinterpreted through their lens of preconceived limitations. "We misunderstood," Patricia said weakly. "We made assumptions based on what we saw, and we were wrong." "But David, surely you can understand our confusion. Why would a hospital executive wear maintenance uniforms and work night shifts?" David's expression softened slightly, and I could see him genuinely trying to help his mother understand the philosophy that had driven his unconventional approach to leadership development. "Mom, how do you learn to run a hospital? How do you understand the needs of night shift nurses if you've never worked nights? How do you make informed decisions about housekeeping protocols if you've never cleaned patient rooms? How do you earn the respect of staff at every level if you've never demonstrated that you consider their work valuable enough to do yourself?" The explanation revealed the depth and thoughtfulness of David's leadership philosophy in a way that made Patricia and Rebecca's social anxieties seem petty and irrelevant by comparison. While they had been worried about appearances and status, David had been conducting a master class in organizational psychology and effective management. "The staff tonight," I said, speaking up for the first time since we had returned home, "they all knew who you really were, didn't they? They knew you were learning their jobs because you respected their contributions." David nodded. "Every department head, every shift supervisor, every team leader knew about my background and my preparation for executive leadership. It was never a secret from the people I worked with directly. The only people who didn't know were the ones who never bothered to ask." The implication was clear and brutal. David's professional colleagues had been included in his transition process because they had shown interest in understanding his role and responsibilities. His family had been excluded because they had demonstrated through their behavior that they preferred their own assumptions to actual information. Rebecca stood up abruptly, pacing to our front window as if she needed physical distance from the conversation. "This is humiliating, David. Do you realize what you've put us through? Do you understand how embarrassing tonight was for us?" "Embarrassing?" David's voice sharpened for the first time all evening. "Rebecca, what exactly did you find embarrassing? Learning that your brother has achieved professional success beyond anything you imagined, discovering that the person you've been condescending to for years actually commands more respect in this community than you'll ever have." The harsh truth of his words cut through Rebecca's indignation like a knife. She had built her entire sense of superiority around the belief that her pharmaceutical sales career made her more successful than her janitor brother, only to learn that she had been patronizing one of the most powerful executives in the region. "That's not what I meant," Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then what did you mean?" David pressed. "Were you embarrassed that I was honest about my work while you wanted me to present a false image? Were you embarrassed that your social positioning strategies were based on complete ignorance of my actual situation?" Patricia tried to intervene before the confrontation escalated further. David, please, we're family. We made mistakes, we misunderstood your situation, but we were acting out of love and concern for your future. David turned toward his mother with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that looked like genuine grief. Mom, love doesn't involve trying to make someone ashamed of honest work. Concern doesn't involve dismissing someone's expressed satisfaction with their career. What you showed me wasn't love, it was social anxiety about being associated with people you considered beneath your status. The accusation hung in our living room like smoke from a fire, impossible to ignore and increasingly difficult to breathe around. Patricia's carefully constructed image of herself as a caring mother concerned about her son's welfare was crumbling under the weight of David's calm analysis of her actual motivations. We wanted you to fit in, Patricia said desperately. We wanted you to be able to move in the right social circles, to have the kind of life that would bring you respect and opportunities. Whose respect? David asked quietly. Respect from whom? The people at tonight's gala who have been working with me for years and already know my capabilities. The hospital staff who see me make decisions that improve their working conditions and patient outcomes. Or respect from people who judge others based on job titles and social positions. The question exposed the fundamental difference between David's values and his family's priorities in a way that made further argument seem pointless. He had spent 5 years building a career based on competence, integrity, and genuine service to his community. They had spent the same 5 years worried about appearances and social positioning. As the evening wore on, and the initial shock of revelation gave way to deeper processing, Patricia and Rebecca began to understand not just what they had missed about David's career, but what their behavior had revealed about their own character. The son they had thought needed their guidance had actually been observing and evaluating them, and they had failed his test in ways that would be difficult to forget or forgive. David, Patricia said finally, her voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat, what happens now? How do we move forward from this? David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his response carefully. This was his opportunity to either rebuild his relationship with his family, or establish new boundaries based on what had been revealed about their fundamental differences. That depends, he said eventually, on whether you're capable of respecting people for who they actually are rather than judging them based on your preconceptions about what they should be. The challenge was simple in its statement but revolutionary in its implications. David was offering his mother and sister a chance at a genuine relationship, but only if they were willing to abandon the social hierarchy thinking that had poisoned their interactions for years. Rebecca returned to the couch, her earlier anger replaced by something that looked like genuine confusion. I don't understand how we got this so wrong, I don't understand how we could have misread the situation so completely. You saw what you expected to see, David replied gently. You assumed that anyone wearing work clothes and doing manual labor must be trapped in a dead-end situation. You never considered that someone might choose those tasks as part of a larger professional development strategy. The explanation was charitable, but it didn't excuse the fundamental lack of curiosity they had shown about David's actual life and goals. They had constructed their entire understanding of his situation based on superficial observations and social prejudices. As the night deepened and emotional exhaustion began to set in, our family found itself at a crossroads that would define future relationships. Patricia and Rebecca could choose to learn from this experience, to examine their own biases and assumptions about worth and respect. Or they could retreat into defensiveness and resentment, unable to accept responsibility for years of condescending behavior toward someone who had deserved better treatment. The months that followed brought a gradual but fundamental shift in our family dynamics. Patricia and Rebecca did eventually apologize, though their words came slowly and with obvious difficulty. They were forced to confront not just their misunderstanding of David's career, but their broader attitudes toward people in service positions and manual labor jobs. The most profound change came in their understanding of respect and social value. They had learned in the most humbling way possible that true worth couldn't be measured by job titles or social positioning. David's success had been built on competence, integrity, and genuine care for others, qualities that had been invisible to them as long as they remained focused on surface appearances. David's leadership at Cedar Valley General flourished in ways that vindicated his unconventional preparation approach. His deep understanding of hospital operations, combined with the respect he had earned from staff at every level, allowed him to implement changes that improved both patient care and employee satisfaction. The 5 years he had spent learning the organization from the ground up proved to be invaluable in his executive role. But perhaps the most lasting impact of that night at the gala was the lesson it provided about the dangers of assumptions and the importance of genuine curiosity about other people's lives. Patricia and Rebecca had spent years offering advice and expressing concerns about David's future without ever taking the time to understand his actual situation or listen to his own expressions of satisfaction and pride in his work. The family that had once been divided by misunderstanding and social anxiety slowly rebuilt itself around new foundations of mutual respect and honest communication. It wasn't an easy process, and there were moments of tension and regression along the way. But the alternative, continuing to relate to each other based on false assumptions and social prejudices, had been revealed as both damaging and ultimately unsustainable. As I reflected on the entire experience, I realized that David's approach to leadership development had taught us all something valuable about the nature of respect and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to understand the complexity and depth of other people's lives and contributions. The night that was supposed to test his social capabilities had instead become an education for his entire family about the true meaning of worth, respect, and the dangerous consequences of judging others based on superficial observations rather than taking the time to understand who they really are and what they actually contribute to the world around them. The story of that evening became something of a legend in our community, though the details were usually softened in the retelling. People spoke about the hospital executive who had spent years learning his organization from the ground up, about the family who had to confront their own prejudices in the most public way possible, about the importance of looking beyond appearances to understand the true nature of someone's contributions and capabilities. But for our family, the experience remained deeply personal, a turning point that had forced us all to examine our assumptions about worth and respect. David had proven that true leadership comes not from social positioning or status symbols, but from genuine competence, authentic care for others, and the courage to do important work regardless of how it appears to people who prioritize appearances over substance. The lessons learned that night continued to influence our family relationships for years to come, serving as a constant reminder that the most important qualities in any person, respect, integrity, competence, and genuine concern for others, are often invisible to those who remain focused on superficial measures of success and social status. The weeks that followed the gala brought a strange kind of quiet to our home on Maple Street, the sort of silence that comes after a storm has passed, but the landscape remains forever changed. Patricia and Rebecca had returned to their respective homes, carrying with them the weight of revelations that would reshape how they understood not just David but themselves and their place in the world. The conversations we had endured in our living room that night had stripped away years of carefully constructed family dynamics, leaving behind raw truths that none of us could pretend to ignore. David returned to his new official role at Cedar Valley General with the same quiet competence he had always displayed, but now the hospital corridors buzzed with energy that came from having leadership that truly understood every aspect of the organization. The transition from unofficial to official authority was seamless in ways that surprised even the board members who had orchestrated his unconventional preparation. Staff who had worked alongside him during his learning years now approached him with a mixture of respect and familiarity that spoke to the genuine relationships he had built across every department and every shift. I found myself observing David with new eyes during those early weeks, not because he had changed, but because my understanding of who he had always been had been fundamentally altered. The man who came home each morning after his shifts had never been the underachieving janitor his family had imagined, but rather someone conducting one of the most comprehensive leadership development programs I had ever witnessed. Every conversation he had shared about finding fulfillment in his work, every expression of pride in his contributions, every quiet confidence about his future prospects had been completely genuine, grounded in a reality that his family had been too prejudiced to perceive.
The hospital itself seemed to thrive under David's official leadership in ways that validated every aspect of his preparation strategy. Patient satisfaction scores continued their upward trajectory, employee retention reached record levels, and the operational efficiency improvements he had quietly implemented during his learning years began producing measurable results that impressed both the board and the broader healthcare community. But perhaps most significantly, the organizational culture at Cedar Valley General began reflecting David's fundamental philosophy that every role within the institution was essential to its mission. Dr. Catherine Brooks stopped by our house one evening during David's second week as CEO, ostensibly to discuss some administrative matters, but really, I suspected, to check on how our family was processing the dramatic changes. She settled into our living room with the easy familiarity of someone who had been part of David's professional journey from the beginning, and her presence brought a perspective on the situation that I hadn't fully considered. "You know," she said, accepting a cup of coffee and looking around our modest home with obvious appreciation, "David's approach to leadership development has become something of a case study in healthcare administration circles. We've had inquiries from hospitals across the region wanting to understand how we develop such effective executive leadership." The comment revealed another layer of David's story that even I hadn't fully grasped. His unconventional preparation hadn't just benefited Cedar Valley General, it had attracted attention from the broader healthcare community as an innovative approach to developing leaders who truly understood their organizations from the ground up. "Has he always been this methodical about his career planning?" I asked, genuinely curious about aspects of David's professional development that had occurred before we met. Dr. Brooks smiled with obvious affection for her colleague. "Always. When we first recruited
David from graduate school, he impressed the board not just with his academic credentials, but with his insistence on understanding every aspect of hospital operations before accepting executive responsibilities. Most MBA graduates want to move into management roles as quickly as possible, but David specifically requested the opportunity to work in every department, to learn from staff at every level. The revelation added another dimension to David's character that made his family's assumptions seem even more absurd in retrospect. Rather than being someone who had settled for menial work due to limited options, he had been someone whose professional ambitions were so sophisticated that he had voluntarily chosen to delay executive recognition in order to build a more comprehensive foundation for leadership. The night shift work was his idea too, Dr. Brooks continued. He argued that hospital administrators who only worked during business hours couldn't possibly understand the realities of patient care, which happens around the clock. He wanted to experience the institution during its most challenging hours, when staffing was reduced and emergency situations tested everyone's capabilities. As Dr. Brooks shared these insights into David's professional philosophy, I began to understand why Patricia and Rebecca's career advice had been so consistently off target. They had been operating from a framework where advancement meant moving away from hands-on work as quickly as possible, while David had been implementing a strategy where temporary engagement with hands-on work was preparation for more effective leadership. The broader community's reaction to David's appointment had been overwhelmingly positive, though it took several weeks for the full implications to become clear. Cedar Valley was a small enough city that news traveled quickly, and David's story became a topic of conversation in contexts far removed from healthcare. Local business leaders began reaching out, curious about his leadership philosophy and interested in learning from his unconventional approach to organizational development. Amanda Foster called me one afternoon, her voice filled with excitement about conversations she was overhearing at her law firm. "Jess, you should hear how people are talking about David. He's become something of a local legend not just because of his success but because of how he achieved it. People are saying he's the kind of leader who actually understands the people he's leading." The community's enthusiasm for David's approach was gratifying, but it also highlighted the contrast with his family's initial reaction. While neighbors and colleagues were celebrating his wisdom and integrity, Patricia and Rebecca were still processing the embarrassment of having spent years trying to fix a situation that had never been broken. 3 weeks after the gala, Patricia called to request a family dinner at our house. Her voice carried a subdued quality I had never heard before, lacking the authoritative confidence that had always characterized her interactions with David and me. The invitation felt significant, like an attempt to rebuild relationships that had been fundamentally altered by the revelations of that night. When she arrived on Saturday evening, Patricia brought with her a bouquet of flowers and an obvious effort to approach the evening with humility rather than her usual commanding presence. Rebecca followed 20 minutes later, also carrying flowers and wearing an expression that suggested she had been coached on appropriate behavior for the occasion. David greeted both women with his characteristic warmth, as if the painful confrontations in our living room had never occurred. His ability to separate their past behavior from present interactions was remarkable, though I could see the subtle caution in his demeanor that suggested he was prepared for continued conflict if necessary. "David," Patricia said as we settled around our dining room table, "I've spent the past few weeks thinking about everything that was said the night of the gala. I've been trying to understand how we got so many things wrong, how we could have misunderstood your situation so completely." The opening was more humble than anything I had expected from Patricia, and it created space for a conversation that might actually lead to understanding rather than defensive justifications. "I've realized," she continued, her voice careful and measured, "that our assumptions about your work said more about our prejudices than about your actual situation. We dismissed your job without ever bothering to learn what you actually did, and that was unfair and unkind." David listened without interruption, his expression neutral but attentive. I could see him evaluating the sincerity of his mother's words, determining whether this represented genuine recognition of the problems in their relationship or simply damage control after public embarrassment. Rebecca leaned forward, adding her own contribution to what felt like a carefully rehearsed apology. "David, I need to acknowledge that my concerns about your career were really about my own insecurities. I was so focused on what other people might think that I never stopped to consider whether you were satisfied with your choices." The admission was significant, revealing a level of self-awareness that neither woman had demonstrated during years of offering unsolicited career advice. But David's response would determine whether these apologies led to genuine relationship repair or remained superficial attempts to smooth over deeper philosophical differences. "Mom, Rebecca," David said quietly, "I appreciate your apologies and I believe you're sincere about recognizing the problems with how our family has communicated about my work. But I need to understand whether you're apologizing for misunderstanding my specific situation, or whether you're apologizing for the broader attitudes about work and worth that led to those misunderstandings." The distinction was crucial, and it revealed David's insight into the deeper issues that had created years of family tension. If Patricia and Rebecca had simply made mistakes about his particular career, that could be corrected with better communication. But if their mistakes reflected fundamental values about social hierarchy and the dignity of different types of work, then rebuilding trust would require much more substantial changes in their thinking. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, clearly recognizing the significance of David's question. When she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability I had never heard before. "I think," she said slowly, "that I've spent most of my adult life believing that a person's worth could be measured by their professional status and social position. I've judged people, including my own son, based on narrow definitions of success that don't actually reflect their character or their contributions to the world." The confession was startling in its honesty, and it suggested that the Gala revelation had prompted deeper self-examination than I had expected. Patricia was acknowledging not just mistakes about David's career, but fundamental flaws in her approach to evaluating human worth. Rebecca nodded in agreement, though her words came more slowly, as if she were still processing the implications of what she was admitting. "I've been thinking about all the times I dismissed your satisfaction with your work, all the times I assumed you were just making the best of a bad situation. I never considered that you might have chosen your path deliberately, that you might have insights into success and fulfillment that I was too prejudiced to understand." David's expression softened as he listened to these admissions, and I could see him beginning to believe that his family might actually be capable of the kind of growth that would make genuine relationships possible. The hardest part for me, Patricia continued, has been realizing how many other people I've probably judged unfairly over the years. If I could be so wrong about my own son, how many other assumptions have I made about people based on their jobs or their appearance or their social position? The question revealed the broader implications of David's test, extending far beyond family dynamics to encompass Patricia's entire approach to social interaction. She was beginning to understand that her prejudices had affected not just her relationship with David, but her ability to recognize worth and dignity in anyone whose work didn't fit her narrow definitions of professional success. As the evening continued, our conversation moved beyond apologies to explore the practical implications of rebuilt family relationships. Patricia and Rebecca asked genuine questions about David's work, expressing curiosity about aspects of hospital administration that they had never bothered to investigate. They inquired about his educational background, his leadership philosophy, his plans for Cedar Valley General's future development. For the first time in years, I watched David share details about his professional life with family members who were actually listening, who were asking follow-up questions, who were treating his insights and experiences with the respect they deserved. The contrast with previous family gatherings was striking, revealing how much energy had been wasted on managing their assumptions rather than building genuine understanding. David described his vision for Cedar Valley General's future with passion and detail, explaining how his comprehensive understanding of hospital operations would enable innovations in patient care and staff support that conventional administrators might never consider. He spoke about programs to improve working conditions for night shift employees, initiatives to enhance communication between departments, strategies for maintaining high-quality care while managing budget constraints. Patricia and Rebecca listened with obvious fascination, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated they were beginning to grasp the complexity and significance of David's responsibilities. For the first time, they seemed to understand that his position required not just administrative skills, but deep knowledge of healthcare delivery, regulatory compliance, staff management, and community relations. David, Patricia said as the evening wound down, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished, not just professionally but personally. The way you handled our prejudices with such patience and dignity shows a character that I failed to recognize for far too long. The acknowledgement was meaningful, but it also highlighted the years of relationship damage that would require ongoing effort to repair. Trust that had been eroded by repeated dismissal and condescension wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, even with sincere apologies and genuine efforts at changed behavior. In the months that followed that dinner, Patricia and Rebecca made consistent efforts to demonstrate their changed attitudes through actions rather than just words. Patricia began volunteering at the hospital, working with patient support services in a role that put her in direct contact with staff at every level of the organization. The experience gave her first-hand exposure to the dedication and professionalism of people whose jobs she had previously dismissed as unimportant. Rebecca used her pharmaceutical industry connections to support hospital initiatives, leveraging her professional network in ways that benefited David's programs rather than competing with his achievements. She began speaking about David's leadership with genuine pride, sharing his story as an example of innovative approaches to professional development rather than trying to minimize or reframe his unconventional path to executive authority. The transformation in family dynamics was gradual but unmistakable. Holiday gatherings became opportunities for substantive conversations about David's work rather than occasions for unwanted career advice. Patricia and Rebecca began asking about hospital initiatives, employee programs, patient outcomes, and community health projects with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. David's leadership at Cedar Valley General continued to flourish, attracting attention from healthcare organizations across the region. He was invited to speak at conferences about innovative leadership development, sharing his story as a case study in the value of comprehensive organizational understanding. The 5 years he had spent learning hospital operations from the ground up had become a model that other institutions were beginning to adapt for their own leadership preparation programs. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of David's revelation was its effect on our community's broader understanding of work, worth, and respect. The story of the hospital executive who had spent years learning every aspect of his organization became a local legend that prompted conversations about assumptions, prejudices, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to understand people's true contributions. Local businesses began implementing their own versions of David's approach, with executives spending time in frontline positions to better understand their operations and employees. The concept of leadership through genuine understanding rather than hierarchical authority became a topic of discussion in contexts far removed from healthcare. Educational institutions began using David's story as an example of innovative professional development, illustrating how unconventional approaches to career preparation could produce more effective leaders than traditional paths. High school counselors and college advisors started encouraging students to consider the value of comprehensive organizational understanding rather than pursuing rapid advancement without foundational knowledge. The ripple effects of that night at the Gala continued to spread through our community for years, creating conversations about respect, dignity, and the complex nature of success that challenged people to examine their own assumptions about worth and achievement. David had intended to test his family's character, but the results had provided lessons that extended far beyond our living room to influence how an entire community thought about work, leadership, and human value. As I reflected on the complete transformation of our family relationships and the broader community impact of David's revelation, I realized that his unconventional approach to leadership development had achieved something remarkable. By choosing to delay recognition in order to build genuine competence, by prioritizing substance over appearance, by demonstrating respect for all types of work through his own example, he had created a model of leadership that challenged everyone around him to examine their own values and assumptions. The man I had married had always been extraordinary, but the night of the Gala had revealed the full extent of his wisdom, integrity, and commitment to principles that transcended social expectations. His willingness to endure years of family condescension in order to test their character, his patience with people who judged him based on superficial observations, his commitment to understanding his organization through direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge, all reflected a depth of character that commanded genuine respect. The story that began with family prejudices and social anxiety had evolved into something much larger, a community-wide examination of how we evaluate worth, recognize leadership, and treat people whose contributions we might not immediately understand. David's revelation had provided more than personal vindication, it had offered everyone who witnessed it an opportunity to reconsider their own assumptions and biases. The legacy of that evening continued to influence our family and community long after the initial shock had faded, serving as a permanent reminder that true worth is often invisible to those who remain focused on surface appearances, and that the most important qualities in any person, integrity, competence, compassion, and genuine concern for others, are frequently found in the most unexpected places and in the most unconventional forms. 2 years later, I stood in the same grand Cedar Hotel ballroom where David's true identity had been revealed, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. The annual Cedar Valley Hospital Foundation Gala had grown into something much larger than a local fundraising event, attracting healthcare leaders and administrators from across the Midwest who came specifically to learn from David's innovative leadership approach. The transformation of both the event and our family's understanding of success had been nothing short of remarkable. David moved through the crowd with the natural authority that had always been part of his character, though now everyone in the room recognized and respected it. He wore his tuxedo with the same comfortable ease he had always displayed at formal events, but there was an additional layer of confidence that came from no longer having to navigate the exhausting process of managing other people's misconceptions about his capabilities and position.
Patricia and Rebecca flanked him as he spoke with a delegation from Johns Hopkins University who had traveled to Ohio specifically to discuss implementing David's comprehensive leadership development program at their own medical institutions. The sight of his family supporting and celebrating his professional achievements, rather than trying to minimize or redirect them, still filled me with a satisfaction that bordered on vindication. The conversation with the Johns Hopkins team revealed just how far David's influence had spread beyond our small community. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, their chief of staff, listened with obvious fascination as David explained the philosophical foundations of his approach to organizational leadership. The key insight, David was saying, is that effective healthcare administration requires genuine understanding of every aspect of patient care delivery. You can't make informed decisions about nursing protocols if you've never worked a 12-hour shift in a busy ward. You can't design effective housekeeping procedures if you've never cleaned an operating room after emergency surgery. Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. We've been struggling with employee morale and operational efficiency for years. Traditional MBA approaches to healthcare management seem to create distance between administrators and frontline staff, rather than building the collaborative relationships that actually improve patient outcomes. Patricia stepped forward with a confidence that would have been unimaginable during her previous encounters with David's professional colleagues. Dr. Morrison, what David discovered is that respect has to be earned through shared experience rather than imposed through hierarchical authority. When hospital staff know that their CEO has literally done their job and understands their challenges, it creates a foundation of trust that transforms the entire organizational culture. The ease with which Patricia discussed David's leadership philosophy, using language that demonstrated genuine understanding rather than superficial familiarity, represented one of the most profound changes in our family dynamics. She had spent the past 2 years not just apologizing for her previous misconceptions, but actively educating herself about healthcare administration and David's specific contributions to the field. Rebecca added her own insights from her pharmaceutical industry perspective. The ripple effects extend beyond internal hospital operations. When David negotiates with suppliers or contractors, they know they're dealing with someone who truly understands how their products and services impact patient care. That knowledge gives him negotiating power that administrators without operational experience simply don't possess. The professional discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia and Rebecca contributing meaningfully to conversations about healthcare policy, operational efficiency, and leadership development. Their transformation from people who had dismissed David's work to advocates who could articulate its significance with genuine expertise was perhaps the most remarkable outcome of that night 2 years ago. As the formal program began, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought our family to this point. The woman who had once sat at table 7, mortified by her husband's honesty about his work, had been replaced by someone who felt genuine pride in his achievements and deep respect for the principles that guided his career decisions. Dr. Chen returned to the podium as he had 2 years earlier, but this time his introduction focused not on surprise revelations but on documented achievements. David's leadership had produced measurable improvements in every aspect of Cedar Valley General's operations, from patient outcomes to staff satisfaction to financial performance. The hospital had become a model institution that other healthcare organizations studied and attempted to emulate. Dr. Miller's approach to leadership development has fundamentally changed how we think about preparing healthcare administrators, Dr. Chen announced to the assembled crowd. By insisting on comprehensive operational understanding before assuming executive authority, he has demonstrated that the most effective leaders are those who genuinely comprehend and respect every aspect of their organizations. The applause was sustained and enthusiastic, but it carried a different quality than the polite recognition typically offered at such events. This was acknowledgement of proven results rather than hopeful expectations, celebration of documented success rather than potential promise. When David took the podium, his remarks focused not on his own achievements but on the collaborative nature of organizational transformation. He spoke about the night shift nurses whose insights had led to improved patient care protocols, the housekeeping staff whose observations had identified infection control improvements, the administrative assistants whose suggestions had streamlined communication processes. Leadership isn't about having the right answers, David said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. It's about creating environments where the people closest to problems feel empowered to identify solutions. My job as CEO isn't to make decisions in isolation but to facilitate the kind of collaborative problem solving that produces better outcomes for everyone. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with her napkin and I realized she was crying. These weren't tears of embarrassment or confusion as they might have been 2 years ago, but tears of maternal pride in a son whose character and achievements exceeded anything she had previously imagined possible. After the formal program concluded, our family found itself surrounded by people wanting to meet David's relatives and learn more about his background and development. Instead of the social anxiety that had characterized Patricia and Rebecca's behavior at the previous gala, they engaged these conversations with genuine enthusiasm and detailed knowledge. A young woman approached our table, introducing herself as a recent healthcare administration graduate who had written her master's thesis on David's leadership model. "Mrs. Miller," she said, addressing Patricia, "I'd love to hear your perspective on your son's unconventional career path. Did you always know he was destined for executive leadership?" The question that would have mortified Patricia 2 years ago now provided an opportunity for reflection and wisdom. "Actually," she said with complete honesty, "I spent several years completely misunderstanding David's career strategy. I made assumptions based on surface appearances that prevented me from recognizing the sophistication of his professional development approach." The young woman looked surprised by Patricia's candid admission, but her interest was clearly piqued. "What changed your understanding?" Patricia smiled with genuine warmth. "I learned that my definitions of professional success were too narrow and too focused on social status rather than actual competence and contribution. David taught our entire family that true leadership comes from understanding and respecting the work that needs to be done regardless of how that work is perceived by people who prioritize appearances over substance." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Patricia sharing insights about the importance of questioning assumptions and the dangers of judging people based on superficial observations. Her ability to discuss these topics with such depth and authenticity represented a complete transformation from the woman who had once coached David on social positioning strategies. As the evening drew to a close, our family gathered in the hotel lobby for a few final conversations before heading home. The contrast with our departure 2 years ago could not have been more dramatic. Instead of stunned silence and family tension, we shared excited discussions about David's expanding influence and the opportunities for continued professional growth. Rebecca pulled out her phone to show us articles from healthcare journals that featured David's leadership philosophy, professional development programs that were adapting his comprehensive preparation model, and universities that were incorporating his approach into their healthcare administration curricula. His impact was extending far beyond Cedar Valley General to influence how an entire profession thought about leadership development and organizational effectiveness. "David," Patricia said as we prepared to leave, "I want you to know how grateful I am for your patience during all those years when I was too prejudiced to understand what you were building. Your willingness to endure our misconceptions while staying true to your principles taught us lessons about character and integrity that we never could have learned any other way." David embraced his mother with the warmth that had always characterized their relationship, despite the years of misunderstanding and misplaced concern. "Mom, those experiences taught me important lessons too. Learning to maintain confidence in my choices despite external pressure prepared me for the kind of leadership challenges that require independent judgment and principled decision-making." The recognition that even the difficult years had contributed to David's development as a leader provided a sense of closure that transformed past frustrations into valuable learning experiences. Our family had emerged from its period of misunderstanding stronger and more connected than ever before. During the drive home, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought us to this point. The man sitting beside me had never changed, but my understanding of who he was and what he represented had been fundamentally altered. The qualities I had always admired in David, his integrity, his genuine concern for others, his commitment to doing important work well, had been present throughout our relationship, but I hadn't fully grasped their professional significance until that night 2 years ago. The community recognition of David's achievements had been gratifying, but the personal transformation in our family relationships had been even more meaningful. We had learned to value substance over appearance, to respect competence over status, to appreciate the complex ways that different types of work contribute to important outcomes. As we pulled into our driveway on Maple Street, the same modest neighborhood where David had always been content to live despite his growing professional success, I realized that this too was a reflection of his character. He had never been motivated by the external trappings of success that his family had once worried he was missing. His satisfaction came from doing work that mattered, building relationships based on mutual respect, and contributing to outcomes that improved other people's lives. The story that had begun with family misunderstanding and social anxiety had evolved into something much larger, a testament to the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the true nature of people's contributions and capabilities. David's patient endurance of years of well-meaning but misguided family advice had ultimately provided everyone involved with lessons about respect, dignity, and the complex nature of success that would influence our relationships and our community for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.